Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today we read about this mysterious temple that Ezekiel was privileged enough to see. God had taken him up on a high mountain and he saw the city, and then he was brought down to the city and was able to see this temple. And this man who had the appearance of bronze had this measuring stick, and he went through and measured this temple, and Ezekiel was able to see the temple in all of its intricate details. And whenever we think about these passages of scriptures, it can be a bit perplexing. Might be hard to imagine what it looked like. That's why I would suggest maybe finding a picture online or somewhere else of this temple, just to help you picture it as you are reading about it, but also to understand what is the significance of it. Because as we look at the measurements and how it was built and the arrangement of everything, it was a temple unlike any other temple that Israel had. Even though it had some of the same components, again, it was arranged much differently. All the dimensions are different. And so it's not like Solomon's temple. It's not like the temple that was constructed after the exiles came back, which is a bit surprising. You would think with Nehemiah and everyone there who would have been perhaps familiar with the writings of Ezekiel, they would have constructed it like this vision of Ezekiel, but that's not done. Herod's temple doesn't look like it. It doesn't really reflect any temple that Israel has ever had in their history. But it did have significance to the exiles. And whenever you come across passages of scriptures like this, you could also kind of follow this with the book of Revelations as well. It's always important to read it first as though you are the immediate readers or the first readers of the writings. For example, we need to ask ourselves as we read these chapters about this temple, how would this have benefited the exiles? Because they would have been the immediate readers. They would have been the ones that Ezekiel was writing to immediately. And what we can probably walk away with here in thinking about that is that it would have benefit to them because it would show the restoration of them as a people. Because there's more in this section of Ezekiel than just the temple. You have basically the reestablishing of many of the components of the life of Israel as it was before. Matter of fact, as I was kind of looking over these chapters, I kind of got the feel for how things were in the wilderness when God had brought his people out of Egyptian bondage and they were in the wilderness. These same things took place. You had God giving them the instructions of the construction of the tabernacle, and goes into some lengthy detail of how that was to be constructed in the book of Exodus. Here in Ezekiel, we'll see a lot of emphasis on the priesthood, and of course there is a lot of emphasis on the priesthood back in the wilderness in the book of Leviticus particularly. Also, you will see here in our reading, or we'll see here in this latter part of Ezekiel, we'll see sacrifices, many different sacrifices mentioned. This also a reflection of what we saw in the book of Leviticus. And we're also going to see the dividing up of the land among the different tribes. Something that would occur in the book of Joshua early in Israel's history. So right after they got out of the land of, or out of the wilderness and into the land of promise, they had the land divided among them. And so what we have in this latter part of Ezekiel is a picture of really God remaking them, redoing what he had already done for them. But as we saw in our past two devotions, even though there is an immediate meaning to the readers that would have read it right away, in that it would have given them hope, perhaps even joy, as they read about this promise of being restored. But it also has a more distant meaning to it, a prophetic meaning that goes beyond just that generation that would come back from exile. And you have a deeper meaning in that it points to the time of the church, the time when after Christ would become the ultimate sacrifice for us, and then ascend to the right hand of the Father. He would send forth His Spirit, establishing God's kingdom here on the earth, and establishing His church. And so a lot of the things that we read here in these chapters would have given hope and joy to those in exile, but it ought to give us profound meaning as we look back on these things and as we reflect upon our own experiences in the spiritual life and in our own experiences within the church life. Now, there's several things about this temple that does very closely reflect various aspects of the church. Now, we don't have time, of course, in a devotion like this to go into every little intricate detail and see the symbolism and the fulfillment of those things in the church. So we're just going to kind of hit it with a broad brush here, just to give some examples. And I tried to pick out ones that would help you guys as you read through these chapters in your reading today to be able to kind of connect some dots and better understand kind of what the deeper meaning of these different things are. Even though some of them may not be specifically mentioned in this devotion. The first thing that really jumps out at you as you read about this temple is all the different measurements. A whole lot of emphasis on the measurements. How wide this is, how tall that is, how deep this is, or whatever. All these different measurements. And what these measurements show is that this temple was a holy temple. Because as you look at the numbers of the measurements, these measurements were seen by the ancients of that time as holy numbers. They weren't just random numbers just pulled out of the air. This was God's way of demonstrating to the exiles that this temple that was going to be established was going to be a holy temple. And when they read these great measurements that were given, they would think, wow, this is a holy temple. But also when you saw these measurements, you'd also see a symbol of perfection, as much of this temple was symmetric. There's a lot of symmetry in the measurements given and the various components of this temple, which shows and symbolizes perfection. And then overall we see this temple as a glorious temple, and we'll definitely see that in our reading tomorrow when we see the glory of the Lord coming into the temple. So it would be a holy, perfect, and glorious temple. And that's what we see with the church. And it's important for us to see that of the church. When we think about the church, we might think about, just our own experiences in the church, our limited experience, looking at it from an earthly perspective, from a fleshly perspective. Maybe we see our brothers and sisters, you see them at their best, you see them at their worst, and maybe we just look at it through the lens of our own experience. But sometimes what we need is a heavenly vision of the church. We need to go up on the mountaintop with Ezekiel and see the church the way that God sees the church. Through God's eyes, the church is holy. God has made us a holy people, and that was the purpose of calling us out unto Himself, so that we would be a holy priesthood, as Peter would describe it. We would be perfected before Him, perfected not upon our own righteousness or good works, but upon the perfect sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And then also a glorious church, as we read in Ephesians chapter 5, and it talks about what Christ had done for the church. It says here that in verse 26, He says that He gave Himself up for her so that He might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that He might present to Himself the church in all her glory. There's the glory. Having no spot or wrinkle, there's the perfection, or any such thing, and that she would be holy and blameless. So holiness and blamelessness are given there. So here all those aspects are mentioned just in those few verses. But we could look further, and we see also that this temple had gates and walls. The walls would represent, of course, that not everyone's included in it. Where there's a wall, you have people that are inside the walls, and then you have those who are outside the walls. And that is definitely true of the church. You have those who have gained access into the Lord's body, into the Lord's church. And then you have those of the world who are on the outside. And, of course, the way that we enter into this body, into this temple, is through Jesus Christ. Remember, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And then in another place He said that I am the door. He says that He was a shepherd, but that He was also the door. And it was through Him that the sheep would enter, come in and out and find pasture. And so Christ is the door, and we have to enter through Christ to enter into this wonderful, glorious temple that He has established. Which brings us to the gates. This also had gates. And these gates were for access. It shows that this church, this temple, is accessible. It's accessible to all. When we think about the church being the temple, we could probably be helpful to turn to a passage such as 1 Corinthians chapter 3 that describes the church as the temple. This is 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 16. It says, Do you not know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. And we see ourselves also as a building, as Peter describes in 1 Peter chapter 2. And he says in verse 4, And coming to Him as a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God, you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood. Sounds very similar to the one here in Ezekiel. But nonetheless, it has these gates, and it is accessible. And these gates were on all four sides, north, south, east, and west, showing that people from all directions could come and join and be a part of God's people. I'm reminded of Luke chapter 13. In Luke chapter 13 and in verse 29, Jesus made this statement that sounds very similar to these gates at the temple. It says, And they will come from the east and west and from north and south, and will recline at the table in the kingdom of God. So he's talking about how many of the Jewish rulers were going to reject the message of Christ. We're going to reject this coming kingdom that Jesus was proclaiming. But people from the north, people from the south, from the east and the west, from all directions were going to come and sit and enjoy the riches of the kingdom. And so these gates could represent the fact that this would come true. We also see the guardhouse. The guardhouses are mentioned quite a bit in our reading today. And what this shows is that the church needs to be protected. And it implies that the church would have an enemy. That's the purpose of having a guardhouse, to protect those within the walls from enemies. And we see in the church life that the elders are given primarily this responsibility to be the watchmen, to be the shepherds that look over the sheep. This was Paul's instructions to the elders at Ephesus as he was about to leave them and never see them again. This is what he tells them to do. He says in verse 28, "Be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock," talking about the church, "among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God which he had purchased with his own blood. I know that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves men will arise speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore be on the alert, remembering that night and day for a period of 3 years I did not cease to admonish each of you with tears," or each one with tears. A guardhouse is a place where a guard would stay, and his call is to be alert, to be watchful, to watch out for the enemy, so that he can warn those inside when the enemy comes. And so the church definitely needs those who stand guard to protect it from error, protect it from false teachers, and to protect it from those who would draw the saints away into sin. Also, this temple had an outer temple and an inner temple, which shows the various degrees of the spiritual life. You have those who are outside the walls, those who are of the world. Then you have those in the outer court who get to enjoy the sacrifice. You get to enjoy Christ as the sacrifice. But then you have those who enter into the inner court. And those are the ones who draw closest to God, to serve him, to serve in his temple, and to administer to not only Christ, but also to his people. And so these are just a few things to think about as we look at the temple, just to kind of get you thinking in the right direction, perhaps, to see some of the symbolism as it does represent the church and foreshadows what we experience even today as the church. Hopefully these things have been helpful to you. I thank you guys for listening in today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.